Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Olly Richards, and I've got a fantastic episode for you today. Really fun conversation with a great guest. But first of all, welcome. If you're new here, this podcast is all about language learning. So we talk about all things relating to how to learn a language quickly, how to learn your second language, things to watch out for along the way. Please subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes delivered to you. And we're available on all the usual places, your Apple Podcasts, your Spotify's, your whatever else people are using to listen to their podcasts these days. Hit the subscribe or the follow button. Also, leave us a review if you've enjoyed the podcast. I really enjoy reading the podcast reviews. I check every one, and if you'd like to leave me a note to say whether you've been enjoying the podcast or not, then I'd love to see it there. Now, today I am having a conversation with my friend Lukas Van Vyve. Now, Lukas, I've known Lukas for many years. He's a really interesting guy, very hardworking, very entrepreneurial, and we are going to talk about a few different things. In this conversation, you will learn what it's like to grow up in a country where 3 languages are spoken. I'll give you a clue. It's not what you think. You're going to hear, why is it that Lukas can get in the car and drive for 45 minutes in a certain direction and not understand anything that people say when he gets there? You're going to hear a very interesting conversation about why is it that often polyglots or language teachers online, they learn their languages one way, but they teach in a different way. Isn't that a little bit hypocritical? And you're also going to hear all about Lukas's method for teaching, which is conversation-based chunking. What on earth is that, and how can it help you? Well, you'll find out in today's podcast. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Lukas Van Vyve of Spring Languages. Enjoy. Lukas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that beautiful introduction. Well done.
Yeah, I improvised it.
You have experience with 400 episodes, no?
Well, yeah, after 400. Welcome to the I Will Teach You a Language. Yeah, you kind of get used to it after a while. So man, you're a very interesting guy. Tell us about Lukas.
So what do you want to know? I'm from Belgium originally. Back here now. I've been in a lot of different countries in the past couple of years. From the northern part of Belgium, Flanders, where we speak Flemish, which is actually Dutch, it's just a different accent, but it's Flemish. There's 3 official languages in Belgium: German, French, and Flemish, right? And so I'm from the northern part. In Belgium, it's very separated for some reason. I don't know why, but like in the north of Belgium, we only speak Flemish. And you learn French at school, but you never really use it in real life or like in daily life, which is something a lot of people are always like confused about. They always think, oh, Belgium, people speak French there. Most people don't actually. And that's me. I studied languages at school, applied linguistics, translation, interpretation, English, German, and Dutch. Then I moved to Scotland for a while, which you probably can't hear in my accent. I did an exchange program there. I didn't really pick up the accent. Then I studied international politics actually. So I moved to France, to Nice, south of France. Then to Berlin for a couple of months, which is part of that international politics degree as well. Then back to France. Then I moved to Italy, learned Italian, moved back to Belgium. Then started traveling to a lot of different countries. I was in Mexico for a while, was in the United States for a while. So I lived in a lot of different countries. And in the meantime, I started learning more languages, developing a method for learning languages, conversation-based chunking. We'll talk about that in a bit. Set up a website. In the beginning, it was called the Polyglot Life. And then I changed it to Effortless Conversations, which is more of my personal website about language learning. And last year, then with my friend Gabriel Gelman, who you all also know, right, Olly?
Sure.
We started Spring Languages together. First language, Spring Spanish, where we make a lot of content on YouTube. So we create a lot of YouTube videos for people who want to learn Spanish.
Fantastic. I didn't know you lived in Scotland. Whereabouts were you in Scotland?
In Edinburgh. So I went to a university that I thought was called Harriet Watt. But apparently in the Scottish accent, it was something like Harriet what? So that's what people said there, right? So there's it's an interesting accent, right?
So tell me what it's like growing up in a place where 3 languages are kind of routinely spoken. are you so you mentioned that you learn French at school, but you don't speak it that much. But I guess it's kind of always around you when you're growing up there, right? So can you just like characterize for those of us who grew up like speaking only English or speaking only one language, what is it like to grow up somewhere where you're surrounded by three languages?
So we are in some ways surrounded by three languages, but it's not really German. So in Belgium, there's only 40,000 people or 50,000, I think, who speak German as their mother tongue. Of course, it's the border with Germany, but it's an official language. Same with French. Well, there's like 4 or 5 million, I think, but it's very, very, very separated. So we have different news channels, different famous people, like people who are famous in the south of Belgium, in Wallonia. We don't know them. I don't know them. In the north, where we are from, we have our Flemish, like famous people, and they're not famous in the south. We can't vote for the same politicians. We don't speak the same language. It's completely separated. So I can go about my day here in Antwerp, where I'm right now. I might need some languages, but it's probably I will need more English than other languages. So we don't really use it that much at all, but we have to learn it at school, of course, right? But there's a lot of people who just, like in the north, who learn French at school, and like in any other country, they don't like learning French or they don't like learning languages. It's difficult. You never use it, so you don't really speak it. And then if you ask people, it's like, yeah, I don't speak French. And in the south, most people will say, yeah, I learned some Dutch at school, but they can't string together a single sentence. And I think the only place where you read a lot of people who are bilingual is in Brussels. So there, yes, there's a lot of people who really live, like with in a place where both languages are spoken, where everything is bilingual, where you're supposed to be bilingual if you want to work for a government or in a museum. But other than that, it's really weird. Like it's very, very, very separated, and it's completely different cultures.
In a very small geographical space as well, right?
Yeah, very, very small.
So I imagine there's a lot of history there. I imagine there are historical explanations for why these things are so separated. But that's probably beyond the. I won't put you on the spot with any of that stuff. But it is interesting.
It's complicated.
It reminds me a little bit of in the UK how obviously English is the common language throughout the UK, although we do have regional languages which are, they're very. Welsh has a fair amount of usage, but the other kind of regional languages in the UK are very much minority languages, to be charitable, but they're basically not spoken widely at all. But the UK is very interesting in the sense that you can drive for 1 hour and in one direction, and the accent will completely change. So if you're in London, you've got one accent. If you go drive a couple of hours or an hour north to East Anglia, you've got a different accent. A couple of hours west to Birmingham, accent changes again completely. 1 hour south of there to kind of Devon, Cornwall, where I am now, the accent changes again. And then you drive a couple of hours up north to Liverpool, Manchester, and every single place you go has got its own really strong accent. And so it just reminded me a little bit about that.
So that happens even in Flanders, which is even smaller. It's like half of Belgium, right? In Belgium, like just to give you an idea, I think 2-3 hours, you can cross the entire country from north to south. You can just drive through the entire country. Half of that is Flanders in the north. If I drive an hour to the seaside, I can't understand people. And
literally,
if you literally can't understand them, like they speak Dutch, but they speak Flemish, like an accent of Flemish dialect. I think I can understand half of what they say. And if they're a little bit like older people who sometimes have like stronger or like older dialects, I can't understand anything, literally nothing. And it's an hour away. And
That's
they
insane.
use Flemish. And then, we have like on television, or newspapers or whatever, on television, on the radio, of course, like that's like standard Dutch, but nobody speaks that, or standard Flemish. Nobody speaks that. It's something that everyone has to learn if you want to work for television. It's a bit like, maybe RP or the Queen's English on the BBC, but even there, people
standard
don't really
Italian, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe like that. It's a really, really strong accent, and it's weird because it's such a small territory in Flanders, and still like everything. Like my dad is from a city that's like 80 kilometers away from Antwerp, 45 minutes by car. If you go there, they have such a strong accent that's completely different. I can understand them there, but it's like people always make jokes about the different dialects and accents in Belgium because it's so different. And then the one from Antwerp, where I'm from, people say that's the arrogant one, and then like, so there's always like all these cities of their own, and then these are like the slow ones, and these are the ones who always have like a hot potato in their mouth to say, there's always like these kind of things that people say about accents and in Belgium. Yeah. But yeah, it's surprising because it's so small. Like for us also, it's weird, 45 minutes away, that's really far away.
Yeah, sure.
I was in Mexico for a long time. There's like 45 minutes as you maybe go to, like if you're in traffic, or in London probably as well, like you can actually go like 5 kilometers and you're still 45 minutes. So in Belgium, that's like far away.
So then if you drive 45 minutes south and you meet these older people speaking Flemish that you can't understand, but you need to communicate, what's the language in common there if you need to communicate?
It will be like more standard Flemish, but it really depends on so for most regions, of course, I can perfectly understand what everyone's saying. Like we can all understand each other. It's only like at the seaside, for some reason, they have a really strong accent that's very, very difficult to understand. They would probably understand me. It will be more difficult the other way around. Then they try to speak more standard Flemish, like you hear it on television or on the radio. Which might be difficult sometimes still. Like we'll understand each other, but it'll be quite difficult. Yeah.
So did you kind of grow up then with no interest in languages then particularly? Is that something that came later?
Grew up with no, but so when I was like 8 or 9 or so, my mom always tells me, so that's what I remember. When people ask me what do you want to become when you grow up, I always said I want to become an interpreter, and I don't know why. I just probably heard it somewhere like, an interpreter, and that's cool, and they work at the EU and they speak a lot of languages. And then some people from my primary school, they still like say, you actually became an interpreter, because I studied interpretation, right? And yeah, I liked learning language. I didn't learn that many, and it wasn't that we used it that many, but yeah, I learned French at school. I enjoyed it. I was good at it. English we learned at school as well. That was just in general, you need a lot of English. In life in general, I think so. That wasn't too difficult. So I always liked languages. I thought, maybe I want to become an interpreter, and dabbled a bit into Spanish when I was like 16 or 17. But it wasn't that I was like always learning languages and using them all the time. Not really. It was only like when I started learning languages at university that I started, traveling more, moving abroad, and then I was like, actually, I love learning languages, and I've learned a lot from learning them at university, which I don't think is the best way of learning them, with a lot of grammar and word lists. And I thought after 4 years, sometimes I was like, well, now I've studied languages for 4 years at university, and it's still so difficult. Like, how is that possible, right? So I was interested in these kind of things. I was like, there must be a better way, and I'm traveling a lot, and then it's nice to be in another country and learn a language, and I think I actually know a better way of doing it. And now I have like my linguistics background, so I can compare a little bit as well to like what is like a traditional way and not. And so it was more that. So then I was like, I'm living abroad now. That's why I want to learn a language. But I wasn't like this person who's like sitting in his bedroom. I'm interested in Mandarin Chinese now, and I'll just start learning it.
Stay in your bedroom for 2 years.
Find people on the internet, and then all of a sudden I speak perfect, like fluent Mandarin, and I've never met anyone.
It's funny, it seems to me, and this might just be the kind of YouTube bubble, but it seems to me there's a lot more people doing that kind of thing now. I guess because it's just more natural to live your life on the internet. Yeah. But one of the great things I'm not a big fan of technology for language learning in general. I think mostly it just gets in the way and distorts reality. But one of the undeniable things about the internet is it has brought incredible access to content, right? You can immerse yourself 24 hours a day in any language you want, if you want to. So I can see for a certain kind of person, perhaps a more introverted type who really enjoys studying and is young enough to kind of have the time and energy to really throw themselves into something that can be, if that's you, then you've got an amazing resource that you wouldn't have had 20 years ago, like when I started learning languages. But so on YouTube recently, I've been doing these videos where I look at people's language learning journeys, and then talk to them about how they did it. So, for example, I did this one with Xiaoma, so Ari, who runs. He has this.
I've seen his videos.
Yeah, Chinese white guy shocks locals.
Yeah,
with
shocks
Chinese.
The locals.
And
New York in a.
And another one with Matt versus Japan, who's got phenomenal Japanese. But it's interesting reading some of the comments that have come back on those videos, because so generally comments on YouTube tend to be utter trash. It's like the bottom of the barrel. But I think there is also kind of intellectual contingent of people who follow this stuff on YouTube who really enjoy discussing it, and they make some points which are interesting to engage with. And one of the things that I've seen recently is something that I think is interesting, which is, so take Ari, for example, Xiaoma. To caricature his journey. So he learned, fantastic Chinese because, and the way he did it was he studied it at university, then he went abroad to China for a couple of years, used Anki a crazy amount, and then kind of lived his life in Beijing and then eventually ended up fluent. But you talk to him now and he'll say, like, actually, I don't think that Anki and rote memorization is the best thing. Instead it's all about immersion. And so if you ask him, what would you do differently? He'll say, yeah, well, I wouldn't spend much time on Anki now. If I was going to do it again, I'd just be immersed the whole time. And then similarly with a little bit like with Matt as well. I mean, because so Matt learned Japanese to an incredible level by just complete, like, masochistic immersion for years and years on end without even coming up for air. I mean, just an incredible amount of just, basically sitting in his room reading Japanese and just really punishing himself emotionally, psychologically, everything. But then the way that he teaches now is different. Man, I'm the same. I learned languages. I was never really kind of that hardcore, but a lot of my early success, I think, with languages came when I was really young and I was just hanging around with people a lot and speaking a lot, which is not what I teach now. And so there's this kind of criticism that I think is valid, which is that the criticism essentially goes like this: look, you guys had success with languages doing one thing, and now you're teaching something else. So you might think intellectually that you have a superior way now, but actually
You don't know anymore.
How do you know? Like, if you found this success by doing these things in the past, like, why are you now changing your story and saying this is a better way? And I think this is very interesting because I think both of us would agree, like, as you just expressed, learning language at university, traditional ways of learning, a traditional method of learning is not optimal. Like, most people, you wouldn't find many people who would disagree with that statement. And yet a lot of us learned that way initially, right? And so you can make the argument, okay, so now you come on to learn your fifth or sixth language and you do it in this different way, but you had to go through this tough period of kind of traditional hard work first in order to, cut your teeth, so to speak. And I find this a very interesting critique. So how would you react to that?
So I agree to some extent. I actually think it's way easier to do full immersion if you've already learned another foreign language, especially if it's one that that's similar structure-wise to a language you've already learned. Because then a lot of the grammar stuff that normally would be completely new to you, you have some more frame of reference. You know already, like, okay, it's a bit similar, or you hear stuff, more language, you can make more connections that way. So I don't think full immersion is really I think you can learn language in a lot of ways. So if you started learning French or whatever, or German in a traditional way, it's not like all lost what you did there. Of course, like, you've learned the grammar, the grammar, maybe you can't speak well, and then you follow up by doing a lot of immersion. Of course, you're going to make a lot of progress really quickly. And then maybe you think, well, it didn't make a big difference because I didn't see the progress, but of course you still had that in you already, So then the real progress came with immersion, but you had that foundation, like you said before. But I mean, for me, for German, for example, it was like that, I think. So I learned it in a traditional way. And then I thought, well, this is maybe not the best way. And then when I was studying, like, international politics, I had a lot of, like, German people in my like, were studying with me. So we were speaking German all the time. And then all of a sudden my German, like, was really, really good. And before it was not bad, but it was pretty bad considering that I've been studying it for 4 years, just like everyone else at my university. Couldn't string together a single good sentence, but there's one language that I actually learned from scratch, entirely with the method that I now preach, right? So it's almost the only language that I literally learned from scratch, and then
That
really
was Italian?
Italian, yeah, exactly. And that one I learned from scratch, only doing conversation-based chunking. Right? I didn't have my own courses yet, but it was exactly the same method, and it worked extremely well. But it was in combination with living abroad. I lived in Italy, so of course I had all the immersion, but I also used that method that we'll talk about in a second, probably, of chunking, which wasn't like I didn't learn grammar rules. I never did.
Because
for Italian.
Yeah. But of course, that was your fifth or sixth language by that point, right? So you had all that experience before you.
It was, I think it was my second or third, but I agree. It was way easier because it was a language. I mean, I learned French at school, German, which isn't the same grammar, but I mean, I had experience with learning grammar or like with structures of different languages. So that made things easier. But I learned it from scratch, and I never really looked at the grammar that much. I read a grammar rule, and then the grammar, mainly I did like this chunking thing that we'll talk about in a second. But it was easier for sure. And I try to account for that in the language courses that we create right now. I try to add in more grammar to give people that like the structure as well that they need, because saying that you don't have to learn any grammar, it's usually not true for most people, unless you're really, really gifted with like language and the structures and you really know what to look out for, right? But yeah, of course, it's way easier to learn another language if you've done one already, and it's also way easier if you've done several years of grammar and you always felt like I didn't learn anything, and then you do immersion, and then all of a sudden you speak well, and then you say, oh well, it's because of the immersion, because at that point I made a lot of progress. Yeah, but you forget everything you did before, right?
Yeah.
So that might be something that comes into play there. Yeah, I think it's a combination always. Like, and of course, we're always trying to intellectualize in some way. Like, I mean, we're creating courses, right? So it's like, okay, what exactly did I do? First I did this and this, and now I need to make it easy to understand for people. So here are 4 steps. And then of course the 4 steps or whatever you have, right, isn't always like the entirely correct sequence of how things happen. But as long as it gives people like something
but that
work
works
with
both
and
ways.
like a methodology, right?
Yeah, it works both ways too, right? Because students often, or especially more intellectual students, often have trouble with this because they want the solution, right? They're looking.
Yeah.
A lot of people will approach the topic of language learning with a kind of question, which is like, right, I need to find the best, most effective, optimal way of learning a language. What is it? And they go out on this quest to sort of analyze these different methods and find, well, how are languages actually learned? And they're kind of continually looking for that. But I think that's kind of an error because that optimal way doesn't exist. Even if because any method has to function within the constraints of the life of the person who's doing it, right? So let's say I could say to you, Lucas, story learning is objectively the most efficient language learning method in the world. We have scientific data. We've got 1 million studies that back it up. It's been proven. Story learning is the best. And you say, okay, but I don't like reading. Well, then it's useless. It doesn't matter if it's the best. It's like it's useless to you. And so immersion. One of the critiques of immersion-based methods, like something that like Matt does, for example, which is kind of very kind of hardcore, like massive amounts of exposure. The essential problem with this is that if you're not motivated enough or you don't have enough time to consistently put that into practice, it's just not going to work for you. So the ultimate truth of this is that everyone has to find the thing that works best for them at that point in their life with their own circumstances, and no one can tell you what the best thing to do is, right? So the students often, like sometimes the smartest people have the most trouble with language learning because they're kind of looking for this magic solution that doesn't exist in that way. Yeah,
language learning is a bit messy always, right? And of course, like you say, it's always like, I want to learn a language, but I only have 10 minutes a day. Well, then you probably shouldn't focus on like total immersion, because you might be like doing immersion with something that doesn't help you at all, right? Or is not helping you. And then you do it for 3 months every day, like listening to something that's way too difficult for you, something that's not comprehensible, maybe like comprehensible input, you don't learn anything, right? Or like you say, you don't like reading, okay, then that doesn't work. So objectively, yes, it might be better, but I totally agree. It always depends on your situation, if you're in the country or not in the country, what you need the language for, what you like doing, how motivated you are in general with these kind of things. Some people just take like a journal, say every day I do this, and they just pencil it in and they do it. And other people are like, yeah, today, what do I feel like doing? Do I feel like reading or listening, or do I want to speak a little bit? And that might also work, as long as you do something. Yeah. But it's important that you, of course, engage with the language. And that's maybe the only important thing.
This is the tension, right? That we know, having learned loads of languages, that the fundamental truth of language learning is that it always depends, and there's no right or wrong. There are no rules. We know that to be, any language learner, any successful language learner knows that to be true. But what the student wants, the beginner student wants, is certainty. It's like, tell me what to do step by step, and I'll do it. And this is a fundamental conflict between those two things. And so, as teachers and educators, all we can really hope to do is say, like, let's take a combination of the things, of the different principles that we know to be true in language learning, and put them together into a method which is somewhat of a artificial construct, but it gives a certain kind of person a very clear pathway forward. Because ultimately, if you have some certainty over what you're doing, you're more likely to do it. If I say, look, do this for 10 minutes, then do that for 10 minutes, you're more likely to follow, which means you're more likely to get success, regardless of the quality of the method.
Maybe. Yeah. I was the same with, like, if I say, you can learn a language without learning grammar. And there's some people who are like, yeah, but I love learning grammar. It's like, well, of course, learn grammar. Maybe it's not the only thing you need to do, right? But it's something that, if you enjoy it, by all means do it, because it means you'll be engaging with the language. Right. And yeah, it's true. Like, you need some sort of certainty. And if you have a path, if you have some sort of method that you can follow, or something, a step-by-step plan, you're probably more likely to succeed, or at least in less time, regardless of the method you follow. I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So with that said, having basically just said, look, no method works.
Yeah.
Or any method works all the time, or none of the time. Kind of depends. Let's talk about your method, because so just to kind of to tie these ends together, people basically, what this means for the average language learner is, like, you got to find what works for you, right? And that could be, and so try five different things, 10 different things, and just be alert to what you enjoy, what seems to work, and then follow that, And so it's a lot of the value that I think, a lot of the value I try to bring here on the podcast by talking to people like you or many of the other guests that we've had recently, is to say, look, here are the different options out there. So, take your pick, see what resonates with you. Like, we had Tamara on recently, who talks all about learning Spanish with music, with salsa, and that's like such a fantastic way of learning. It's the kind of thing that's going to really appeal and really light a fire for lots of different people. Not everybody, but it's a really unique way. So let's talk about, you've talked about this conversation-based chunking. So tell us about what does that mean?
Sounds a bit academic, right? But it is in some way. So it's more of a, I don't know, like, I sometimes think of it more as like a meta method, or more of like a mindset when you're in a language, more so than saying, like, learn Spanish with music or learn Spanish with immersion, because you can do it with everything, right? And basically it's based on the idea that if you want to learn a foreign language, that you're much better off by starting to listen to native speakers speak that foreign language. So you really listen to them, or read, or whatever you enjoy, and see what they say, exactly what they say, which word combinations native speakers use when they speak. And these are called chunks, and we'll talk about that in a second. And once you've seen these, just use exactly these same things that you've just heard, as opposed to starting by learning a lot of words, isolated words and word lists and grammar rules. And why is that the case? Well, because if you start by words and grammar rules, if you start by learning these things, and you then try to string together a sentence in your target language, well, you don't know what that sentence is supposed to look like, right? You might have some abstract idea of what it is supposed to look like because you know some grammar, but you don't have that frame of reference. You literally don't know, is this a sentence that I like? What is this sentence supposed to look like? So you try to string it together then maybe, and you will have to think a lot about grammar rules, and then, like, every single word you have to think, oh, which conjugation here, or which preposition do I need to use? And maybe if your language is like word gender, you need to think about gender. And then by the end, maybe you've created a sentence that you've probably based on your target language, right? Because you've been translating in your head because you don't know what the sentence in your based on your mother tongue, right? And and then at the end you'll probably think, like, okay, I said something, I maybe got my point across because I used some words that are used in my target language, but I don't know if that's really what a native speaker says. You just don't have that frame of reference. But if you start by listening to native speakers, or stories, like what you have that frame of reference right away. Your frame of reference is now what a native speaker says and not what the grammar book says, right? So you see a full sentence, you probably think something like, oh, okay, so that's what a native speaker says. That's how a native speaker says, I'm hungry, or happy birthday, or whatever they say, like anything they say. You've seen now what native speakers say, so you can say the exact same thing. And you don't have to think about the grammar all the time when you do that, right? You can often just have that aha moment. You like hear something and like, oh, that's what they say. Oh, I didn't know that's how I need to say, I know, like nos vemos, for example, like see you in Spanish. Like all that stuff, you just hear it and then you just use it as well without thinking about the grammar behind it. And that's the idea behind the conversation-based chunking. You start by listening to conversations and you take that as a frame of reference. You look for the word combinations that they use and you just memorize them in some way and you use them yourself. And then if you combine that with some grammar studies, right? So you know the structure a little bit better, it'll be much easier to speak that language. You won't be translating in your head that much. You won't have that always like that nagging feeling that I always had, and for sure you had the same experience as well. Like you like say something and it's like, oh, I don't know if that's really good sentence, right? I think I followed the grammar rules, but I don't know if I followed the native speaker rules, right? And that's basically it. You try to find these word combinations, these chunks that native speakers use instead of focusing so much on grammar.
The thing that characterizes this, I guess, is that you're a couple of things. First of all, you're focusing on input rather than actually learning the theory. So it's kind of top down rather than bottom up, if you like, which means you're going to learn what people actually say and actually use in the language rather than, focusing on artificial rules in your textbook. But also you're using a very important concept in language learning, which is known by a few different things. It's known as chunks. It's also known as collocations. In a very kind of simple way, you could generalize and say, well, phrases. But it's the idea that words very rarely exist together by themselves, right? So if I'm going to say something like, that word like, for example, something like is a combination that's very, very, very frequent.
Yeah.
And then what else could there be? That phrase there, what else could there be? What else is there? Like I don't sit there thinking, okay, what word comes after what? And then else, and then I take the phrase,
it just rolls off the tongue, right?
It rolls off the tongue because I've used it lots of times before. So these are two kind of really powerful principles of language learning. The idea of learning through input, so you're learning what people actually use, and then also learning combinations of words, because it's a lot easier. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? Because sometimes when I tell people about collocation or chunking, they say, well, it sounds very difficult learning these combinations of words. It's a lot easier just to learn one word. But I've always found it's a lot easier to learn complete phrases
because you have context.
You have context, exactly. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so that's exactly what you said. So these chunks are super important. And the same because sometimes like grammar, it's just like a generalization in some way. I think like, you have the language, then people thought, okay, there is structure in that language, right? Let's try to find all the structure, all the rules and everything, but they don't always cover everything. And in English, just like I think one of the best examples is that you can say Merry Christmas, right? You can also say Happy Christmas, maybe not in the UK, but like in some places in the world they say Happy Christmas. You can also say Happy Birthday, but if I say Merry Birthday to you, like you'll think like, we don't say that, right? But it's an adjective and a noun together. Yeah, like I can't think of any grammar rule that says that I can't say Merry Birthday to you, and you will understand me, but it's not what a native speaker would say, right? So if you learn with words and grammar, these kind of things are going to happen all the time, because you're going to think, oh, I need an adjective here. So in my mother tongue, we say something like this. We say maybe the same thing for Merry Christmas and Happy Birthday. Maybe we use the same word in my mother tongue, so I can also use it. And then I say Merry Birthday, right? And then that just doesn't work. And language is full of these chunks, right? It's also how they exist in your brain. That's why they roll off the tongue, and that's why, like in your mother tongue, you don't think about grammar. It's always these patterns, and it's also easy to explain. I think it's just like you hear them so often. Like if you always hear people around you as a kid and just in general say Happy Birthday, and you never hear Merry Birthday, well, your brain knows, like when it hears it, like, these words are not used together, right? There's no like connection in your brain. Like neurons that fire in some way, right? But with Merry Christmas, it's like, immediately, like that just rolls off the tongue. It just comes automatically. So that's why chunks are so important. If you can identify these and you can use them as well, then there's so much less things to think about when you speak. Right? I don't have to think about any of these like grammar rules when I just say a sentence that I know is correct because I've heard a native speaker say it, and because my brain is so used to saying it that way in these chunks, in these word combinations. And that's why it's so much easier, like I think, to learn a language that way.
Yeah. And when you mentioned grammar there, and because it's not just phrases, is it like Merry Birthday or Happy Birthday or Merry Christmas? The grammar, if we kind of extrapolate this principle, then it also applies to learning grammar. And so often people, I mean, you'll know this from Spring Spanish from your students there, that one of the things that students of Spanish complain so much about is, well, how do I know which verb tense to use? How do I know whether I should use the present perfect or the preterite? And how do I know, do I say he ido, fui, or iba? How do I choose between these? The verb tenses in Spanish for native English speakers are often really difficult, but they don't have to be. They're only difficult if you try to take a rules-based approach, and then every time you use the past tense, you have to filter it for all these rules. Like, is it case one? Is it case two? Is it case three? What's the appropriate one here? But if you take this idea of kind of learning from what native speakers actually say, let's take a phrase like, how have you been? Now, you can learn this as a chunk, right? How have you been? 4 words. I'm not thinking of the individual words. I'm thinking of the phrase, how have you been? Good to see you. How have you been? But within that phrase, how have you been? There's grammar, right? Because there is a how have you been. There's the present perfect in there, which means that without thinking about the grammar, you're accurately using this past tense to ask a question, and you're getting it exactly right. Now, if you learn enough of those types of phrases, then you will start to intuitively understand the basic principle, which in this case, how have you been, is the idea that we're speaking in the present but referring to the past. And when that happens, you use the present perfect, right? Same in English as it is in Spanish, broadly speaking. And so you can learn grammar through that way as well. So how do you with conversation-based chunking, do you also kind of teach grammar in that way, or how does it fit in?
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the whole point. Like, it's always about communication in some way. You want to say, how have you been? You don't need to know any other conjugation table. You don't need to know the full conjugation table. I have been, you have been, he has been. I mean, in English it's easy, but in Spanish it actually will be more difficult, right? You don't need to know it all, like in that. And that's what happens to a lot of people, right? It's like, you want to say something, oh, second person, what was the conjugation table again? Have, has, have a. So then you start thinking that way. You don't need that. You can just say, how have you been? Not know anything about grammar, and you can still say it correctly. Right? So that's what we usually try to do in with conversation-based chunking. Yeah, we just give people a lot of sentences, context, and within that context, like, we will put grammar, right? And the way we usually teach this, and this is not the only way, but something that works really well is using close cards for this. So you would take a sentence, how have you been is maybe not the best example because you can't put anything around it. But let's say that you want to say something like, we'll see you in the afternoon. Nos vemos por la tarde. So then, first of all, how do you know that you have to say nos vemos? We see each other. You don't. There's no grammar rule for it. But if you hear it often enough by native speakers, you'll think like, oh, okay, so apparently you have to say nos vemos and not te veo en la tarde or something like that, or por la tarde. So that's one thing. But what we then do is we put it on a flashcard and we blank out the chunk that we want to learn. Right? So if it's nos vemos por la tarde, I want to learn nos vemos, that's like the conjugation for like first person plural, the verb ver. And like, that's what we want to learn. And we just make a flashcard. On the front, we add blank por la tarde. We say, okay, it's see you in the afternoon. And then on the back, we would just add the full sentence, like nos vemos por la tarde. So we always try to fill in the chunk. And that's, I think, one of the biggest hacks you can use if you like you're learning like spaced repetition systems or flashcards, not learning isolated words, and definitely not learning them like without context, but learning chunks within the context of a sentence. Because it has so many advantages that way, Like, you learn them like that, you have context. You probably also have context from people you've heard like saying that, right? or a textbook where you read that. And if you see a flashcard that says por la tarde, you're like, okay, that's from that podcast interview that Olly and Lucas did. And then I heard this example. And what were they talking about? Oh, yeah, it was nos vemos por la tarde, just because you have so many more connections. And you have a chunk, so you can immediately use it in the conversation, and you have all that context around it, and you're using the advantage of like memorization with spaced repetition if that's something you enjoy. That's how we always try to do it. So whenever we teach a tense or whatever, we'll just make a dialogue or a conversation, add a lot of these in there, highlight them in some way so people get used to them just by listening to it over and over and over, and then also give them flashcards in some way so they can actually use these chunks, like actively memorize or imprint them on their brain.
How do you deliver flashcards? Because flashcards are always, I find them so, because the principle is completely sound, but there's always an issue around flashcards, which is that people that try to use flashcards always end up spending more time making them than they do actually studying with them. So I imagine you provide these flashcards in
it took me a while to figure out the best way.
Yeah, I'm curious how you do it, because I this is something I think about. We're going off on a bit of a tangent here, but because a lot of people kind of just give people Anki decks. Is that what you do, or do you have a different?
I did it in the beginning, and it was a mess, because you need to make them, you upload them to your website. People need to download them. They need to make an Anki account. You need to import them. It was a support nightmare for us. Like when we did that, like people had so many questions, it didn't work. But yeah, you can totally do this with. I mean, there is close cards in Anki, so it works perfectly fine with that. We switched to make an ad here, hidden ad for Brainscape, right? So we use Brainscape. They allow you to make flashcards, like flashcard decks with these kind of like close cards, and you can share them easily with students. Like you just make it a deck and you share a link, and then people can add them to their accounts. And it's a flashcard app like any other. It's nothing special in terms of functionality, but it
more user friendly than Anki.
It's more user friendly because it's easier to use and because it's easier to distribute for us. And also, if there's a mistake in a flashcard, I can easily change it, edit it, and then it's a cloud-based system. So there's an app, there's a website. So that works well.
Can you embed those flashcards? People are going to just lose the plot here, but I want to ask the question anyway. Can you embed those flashcards in a course area like Teachable or WordPress, or do you have to use them separately?
No. Yeah. So you give them a link, and then they can just make an account. Brainscape, they can download the app if they want to, or do it on the computer, and then they can add them to their account there. But you have to give them a link, so it's not possible to embed them. I haven't found a way to do that in a good way, unless you make an app, Olly. But I don't think you want to make an app for language learning, right?
It's not really, but if it would help our courses, then potentially. But we've been having this discussion recently within the StoryLearning team, because we kind of want to take a fresh look at the way that we give practice activities within our courses, because I mean, I'm very much a kind of proponent of, if you read enough, you'll learn all the stuff you need to know anyway. But I also think that a bit of deliberate practice is helpful. So the question is, well, how much exactly? And I think we've been giving a bit too much in our courses, actually looking at worksheets and things like that. Whereas we want to make it a bit more sort of streamlined.
Yeah.
But ideally, we want to do it in a way where you can do that stuff rather than having PDFs. You can do it in
an interactive way
inside the courses.
Yeah. So I think there's two parts for me to deliberate practice that are important, and in some way, like in conversation with chunking, is pretty elegant, right? I don't think we actually said what the 4 steps were. So first step is getting that input, listening to conversation. Step 2 is making it active or a deliberate effort, like say to notice these chunks, right? Noticing, you've talked about that before, I think as well, is super important when you learn a foreign language. You need to not just listen to what native speakers say and try to understand, but actually look at like the exact word combinations they use, because that's where you're going to discover these chunks, right? Because it's very easy to try to understand something and then, I understood the gist of this sentence, but you don't know the exact words they used. And if you know that and you see these chunks, you make an active effort to identify them, everything you want to be able to say yourself as well. That is in some way already like a deliberate exercise, and we highlight chunks, right? So we do that for people. So we highlight chunks in all the lessons we have in our courses to help them with that, to really show you like, this is important. Like, notice this, please, because it's important. So that's one thing. And then, deliberate practice can be just taking chunks from there and just memorizing them, imprinting them on their brain in some way before you start speaking. And that's how we do deliberate practice. We add some exercises as well, sometimes for some more difficult grammar topics, but the main deliberate, exercise can be just trying to notice. And that's why I said in the beginning, it's more like a mindset, more like a meta thing, because you don't need to take a spring Spanish course or a story learning course, whatever, although it works perfectly with story learning, of course, but you don't need to do that. You can just watch a telenovela or something, or in Spanish, or just a soap opera or a series, or you can read a book if you want to, as long as it has enough like actual conversational language in it, of course. But
let's take
just
that as
like
an
a
example.
mindset.
So let's imagine you're reading. Well, let's imagine you're reading one of my books, and there's a dialogue in there, and then you want to apply conversation-based chunking method to that. What might you do if you could lay it out step by step? Let's say so you're learning by yourself with the help of a book. What would a study session like that actually look like?
So I would literally just read that Spanish dialogue, see how much I understand at first, without looking. There is a parallel translation in your books, right? Or not? Or is there?
No,
there's no translation.
No,
so that makes it a little bit more difficult. Yeah. So I like to work with.
But that's also the reality of most content that you're going to be learning with, right? If you're watching TV or a book, you're usually on your own.
And that's why we create courses to make it easy.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I write books, right? Because reading Don Quixote is a bit too hard. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you don't have that, so what I would do, okay, we'll take your example. If you don't have a parallel translation, if you have one, very easy. You just compare English and Spanish. You read the whole Spanish dialogue, you see what you understand. Then you look at the English one to make sure you understood correctly, and then you just look for word combinations. Anything that stands out in any sentence where you think, oh, so that's what a native speaker would say. And this is really something, I sometimes call it an aha moment or an epiphany, because it really feels like that once you start doing it. You just listen to people, it's like, oh, that's what you need to say. Oh, I had some sort of like weird sentence I always use with words and grammar rules that I translated literally from my mother tongue, but I didn't know native speakers said it this way. But now I know because I just read it, right? So that's the only thing I try to do. I just read that whole thing and I'm like, yeah, okay, this is a chunk that I can see myself use as well. If just to take the example from before, if you say, or someone saying like mucho gusto, nice to meet you, I read and it's like, okay, so I don't have to translate word for word nice to meet you in Spanish. I can just use mucho gusto. Very good. I'm going to memorize that in some way. I'll use flashcards, or maybe I just remember because it's not that difficult, and I'm using that myself. And I just go through the whole dialogue like that, right? If you don't have a parallel translation, sometimes it might be difficult because you don't understand everything yet. I usually use a dictionary called context.reverso.net, which is a dictionary it's almost like a chunking dictionary. Literally, when you look at it, it's the best thing I've ever found, like for language learning, when it comes to like dictionaries and looking up words and so, because it's you can just add a chunk in Spanish and it gives you the chunk in English within sentences. It just shows you all the sentences, which is exactly what conversation-based chunking wants you to do, right? Or the other way around, you have a chunk in English and you want to look for the Spanish one. Well, you just write down what you want in English and then it gives you all the sentences, like 20, 30 different examples or more even, with the chunks in different contexts as well. So you can compare, like, is it always used mucho gusto? Does it always mean nice to meet you? And then you just see like, yeah, it's in every single like example in context or reverso.net, it just shows you like a nice to meet you, mucho gusto example. So then you know that. And then, yeah, if I don't have flashcards for it yet, I would often make flashcards, right? That's what I did when I learned Italian, for example. I used an Assimil book when I started learning Italian, because they have these parallel translations, right? They have dialogues and then a parallel translation in English. And I didn't even care about the grammar. This is literally what I did. I just took a lesson or two lessons, a dialogue. I made flashcards from all the chunks that I found, everything where I thought, oh, I can see myself use this when I'm talking to my friends later on today. And I just learned them. And then I practiced a lot, of course, because I was in Italy. But that's the only thing I did for that. So that's basically what you would do. You would just read, but really try to actively notice all these chunks, these word combinations that you see there, that you wouldn't have been able to come up with yourself just by learning words and grammar.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, listen, man, this is a method that I think I've used myself in various different forms. It's a very intuitive method. I think this is the reason that I like it. It's just, for people who I think people who sit down and learn languages themselves and think, right, how am I going to figure this out? Let me figure out this language. It's a very intuitive thing to do, which I really, really like. So for people that want to learn more about you and your project at Spring Languages, where can they go to discover more about this?
So if you're learning Spanish, You can just go to YouTube and type in Spring Spanish. And we publish a lot of videos every week. We have some teachers who teach with chunks. So we teach a lot of chunks. You can also go to Spring Languages. There's some more resources there if you want to learn more about conversation-based chunking. If you're learning any other languages, I also have a separate website, which is my original website called Effortless Conversations. There's a book there as well. I have a book on Amazon about conversation-based chunking that like lays out like everything step by step. If you want a 12-week plan, and we talked about this before, some people want like a step-by-step plan. If you want that, you can take a look at the book. So these are the places for Spanish, Spring Spanish, or Spring Languages. For the other languages, Effortless Conversations.
Cool. And if people want to get in touch with you personally, we'll put links to your various social media in the show notes as well.
Sounds good.
So people can get in touch with you. So Lukas, thanks so much, man. And
thanks again for having me.
Look forward to when the world opens up properly, having a beer on a beach somewhere.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll be able to meet up soon.
Yeah, indeed. All right, man. All the best.
You too.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT. And if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.